Welcome to this evening's webinar, When Mental Illness Strikes, Crisis Intervention for the Financial Plan. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. For Q&A, please use the Q&A icon to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will answer your question live or offline. You may also submit questions via email to Allen@northstarplanners.com. Allen is spelled A-L-L-E-N. Tonight's speaker is Giese. Allen is the author of the book, When Mental Illness Strikes, Crisis Intervention for the Financial Plan, and the founding partner of North Star Financial Planners, a wealth management firm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, dedicated to working with families who have a loved one with mental illness. As the father of an adult son with mental illness, Allen and his wife Gail work tirelessly advocating on behalf of those with serious mental illness. In 2015, Allen founded Ride to Awareness, a nonprofit that raised awareness of the stigma attached to mental illness. With Ride to Awareness, Allen and a half dozen other cyclists bicycled over 3,000 miles from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, raising funds and awareness for this cause. Allen is the president of the local chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, in Broward County. As you'll discover in tonight's webinar, Allen is passionate about helping families who have a loved one with a mental illness make better financial decisions and improve their lives.
So good evening, and thank you for being here with me tonight. I know you've probably got lots of other things you could be doing, so I'll certainly respect that and try and give you everything I've got. Let me begin by telling you where all of this developed and why I do this. My wife Gail and I were standing in our bedroom late one evening, looking out into our patio area through the glass doors in our bedroom at our son, who was standing by the pool yelling and screaming at the pool. And I think the pool might have been yelling and screaming back at him. See, earlier that day, we had gone to a friend's house for dinner. And on our way, he was clearly agitated. I mean, he'd been battling anxiety for months, but it was getting the best of him that day. And on the car ride to our friend's house, he was just having a really hard time. So when we got to our friends, he continued to struggle with it. His regular coping techniques just weren't working very well. I kept going outside to smoke and try and calm down, but we finally just threw in the towel and told our friends, listen, I'm sorry, but we have to leave. So on the car ride back home, his anxiety continued to develop and escalate to the point where when we got home, he was a wreck. We had no idea what we could do for him. I mean, he got out of the car, he bolted through the house, went out the back door, and went for a walk in the woods behind our house. And it was more like a frantic run, I think, than a walk. But it was pitch black back there. I mean, it's late at night, and he was gone for quite a while. And eventually he came back, and he was even more agitated, and he was walking around the pool, and his hands were all knotted up and tight, and you could just see all the tension in his body and the anguish on his face, and he was ranting and raving, and then he started screaming at the pool. And I think in his mind, the pool was screaming back because it was almost like a yelling conversation. We had no idea what was happening to our son that night, but that was his first mental health crisis. So since my son was diagnosed with a serious mental illness at the age of 18, my wife and I learned the hard way what that impact was to our family's finances and our future financial security. And we learned a few hard truths along the way. Because of our family's experience and my many years as a financial planner, my passion is helping families who have been stricken by a serious mental illness make better financial decisions and achieve what has now become their most important goals and objectives. Go back to sharing the screen. So many of you are aware of something called Crisis Intervention Team Training, or CIT training. It's available to police officers in your town. If you're not, CIT training is specialized training for police officers so that they have a better understanding and can ultimately better deal with a person who is having a mental health crisis. Now, traditional policing techniques don't really work very well, especially when they're focusing on counter-aggressive behaviors and escalation. We know that can be very counterproductive when used against a person in crisis, and we know that that's when bad things tend to happen. CIT training, on the other hand, teaches these officers techniques that work and gives these officers insights into what's going on with that person who's in crisis. You get better outcomes and fewer people get hurt. Now, traditional financial planning, much like traditional policing, just doesn't really do the job when it comes to family finances when a severe mental illness is involved. The problem is most traditional financial planners are trained on a transactional level. And all you really have to do is look at how they're compensated to realize how true that is, regardless of whatever the initials are after their names. The reality is that the right choices for families going through a mental illness with adult children often don't involve the purchase of any sort of financial product. Instead, it's about making good, sound financial choices, having good financial counseling to avoid costly mistakes. It's about making wise, often non-common sense choices that give your child, your son or your daughter, their very best future. Excuse me. So in the same way that a police officer who's handling a mental health crisis situation using traditional policing methods can quickly make a situation worse, a traditional financial advisor can do the same thing with the addition of inefficient or expensive strategies. So what I aim to do in this webinar this evening is to offer you sort of a CIT level experience and perspective on the financial issues that arise when a family member is diagnosed with a serious mental illness. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to focus on three big areas. We're going to focus first on what are the biggest challenges and concerns that families face. We're going to talk about the strategies and the tools that can help families in this situation. And we're going to try and keep it kind of on a 30,000 foot view so that we're not going to, otherwise we're going to be here for hours and hours and hours. But I just want to put things on your radar that I think need to be there. And third, we're going to talk about language, the language that we use, because, well, words really can matter, especially in this world, the world of mental health. So at the end, I'll be sure and leave a little time for questions. As you saw, there's the Q&A icon that you can submit any questions to, or you can always email me questions as well, and I can either answer them if we have time, or if I know the answers. If I don't know the answers, I'll probably send them to you offline. All right, so let's move on in. So what are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest concerns that families have? Now, in my book, I use this analogy of firefighters who have this clear understanding of the principles of how fires burn. So they know when they can run into a building and when they really probably shouldn't. These guys and gals are taught and they're heavily trained in these principles, and they're willing to trust these principles with their lives. Now, I use this example for a couple of reasons. One, because I have a whole bunch of friends that are firefighters and I've learned this from them. But two, because it so perfectly demonstrates how critical it is that you operate first on a solid set of principles that are correct. They have to be like building blocks. They have to be solid and they have to be true. Now, if you don't have that, you end up with some really bad outcomes. Now, in the case of my firefighter friends, they die. It's the ultimate reality. Now, if the firefighters were to start operating on a slightly false, even slightly false set of principles, the outcomes would be tragic. Now, in the world of financial services and financial advice, we also have to operate on a good, correct set of principles first. And these principles need to be no less right than those that the firefighters' lives depend on. But in the financial world, the outcomes, well, they just aren't as immediate and they don't just seem as obvious. So you can have advisors out there who are operating on a set of principles that, perhaps academically they aren't really all that solid, but the average person just doesn't realize it until it's too late. So let me ask you a question. If your life depended on it, would you want the principles that you're operating on coming from somebody who's trying to sell you something? Or would you want those principles coming from, say, the academic community, maybe some geeky professors that all they want to know is, how does something work? What's the real way this thing works? What's the most efficient way this thing works? They just want to know what's right. Which would you choose? So, I guess that's pretty much a loaded question. Obviously, given those two choices, you'd want your principles to come from the academic community, I'm sure. Something that's based on, sound research, science, proven outcomes, real historical evidence. But is that really what's happening in the world of financial services? And I'll tell you, after 28 years of doing this, I'm here to tell you it's not, at least not for the most part. I realized this about 18 years ago. It was probably about 10 years into my career. And I made a huge shift. I made a shift from getting my facts and my data from Wall Street, which is basically trying to sell my clients and me product, to getting my core information from those that didn't have any sort of incentive to steer me and my clients. And that would be from the academic world. And it's made all the difference in outcomes for both me and my clients. So when I decided to follow my passion and help families in this world of mental health, I wasn't going to storm ahead just based on my own experience or intuition or my gut instinct, because that's just a sample of one. And it's not something you establish principles on. So I needed to find what really were the biggest concerns that people had, how successful were people at solving them, and who is solving them out there. So I started looking. There's not a lot out there, folks. Actually, as you probably know, otherwise you probably wouldn't be on this webinar. There's hardly anything that focuses on financial planning for families that are dealing with a serious mental illness. So I ended up doing the next best thing I could think of, and I just did my own study. So I talked to as many people as I could who had first-hand experience. I talked to parents, I talked to providers, I talked to leaders of mental health organizations like NAMI and MHA, and I asked them, what are your biggest concerns? What are your biggest challenges? What are the most pressing problems that you face? What keeps you awake at night? What specifically are the financial challenges that you're facing? And what is it that you fear the most? Then I asked them if they felt like they were successful at overcoming those challenges. And I asked them, hey, if it had been available to you, would an empathetic financial planner, would they have been helpful to you at that point in time? So the number one concern that I got back from these interviews was, it was like Curly from City Slickers. Hopefully you saw that movie a long time ago. But Curly's telling Billy Crystal that he needs to concentrate on one thing. It's that one thing you got to focus on. Well, that one thing, that number one concern that I heard from virtually every single person I interviewed was this question. It was, who's going to take care of my kid when I'm gone? I got that from the first interview to the last interview and every single interview in between. But the solve rate was minimal. When I asked people, how well do you think you've done in accomplishing that? Hardly anybody said, we've got it covered. Now, it was really interesting to me because it was such a big problem that for many people, the choice was the equivalent to just sticking their head in the sand. They just ignored it because it was just too big to solve, which explained to me why so many people I talk to, people who come into my office or call us for help, who are in their 60s and their 70s and still taking care of their son or their daughter with a serious mental illness and no plan for the future. Now, I know part of that is because in many times their son or daughter hasn't been diagnosed until they were in their 50s or sometimes their 60s. But at some point, mom and dad's own mortality comes into question and they know they have to solve this problem. It's time. Well, I learned that this problem was more than just who's going to pay the bills and where's the money going to come from and who's going to make sure that they take their meds. It had a lot to do with advocating for them through complicated healthcare systems and inadequate housing and the long-term decision making. But even just as one person told me that I remember so clearly to this day and it resonated so well with me, he said, who's going to make sure he's brushing his teeth? That just really hit me. So another dominant concern I heard in these interviews was the fear that their son or daughter was going to get seriously hurt at some point when they were in crisis. Now, a lot of it was pointed at law enforcement. Now, every parent I talked to had stories about their kid being in crisis and had some bad outcomes because basically ignorance prevailed. I know in my community, the number of trained CIT officers is increasing, but I also know that there's still a whole lot of communities out there with very few, or in some cases, zero officers with this absolutely critical training. That has to change, or people are going to continue to get hurt or worse. I'll tell you that in my case, while of course we'll never know for sure, I'm pretty sure that CIT training has saved my son's life at least once. So what specific financial challenges did people express to me in these interviews? They were deeply concerned about health care, and if they could continue affording to pay, to afford to pay for out-of-pocket costs and treatment and deductibles. But one of the biggest concerns, I know somebody on this call, I saw it in the notes, expressed that the same concern was affordable housing. And that is just such a tough one. If your son or daughter doesn't have the skills to live alone, the harsh reality is for most people, there's just not a whole lot of choices right now. And that, of course, has to change as well. That's why we advocate so hard for housing money with the state. The number of group homes and assisted living facilities that accept mental health residents is far too few for what we need. And what's available is often in neighborhoods that just people don't feel safe. And places where there could be a real concern that your son or daughter might be exposed to potential harm. So moving on, I asked these people how successful they felt they were in dealing with the financial aspects of mental illness. Now, the answers I got back were all over the map, but basically dependent on the financial status of the family. Of course, those that were in the more affluent side, as you could guess, could pursue solutions that many others couldn't. But interestingly enough, how proactive people were also seemed to be one of the bigger differences for outcomes. So I think proactivity seems to be like one of the most critical things that you can have. Most people I talked to, however, generally didn't feel like they were successful as they needed to be and felt that there was tremendous room for improvement. So here is where the stigma associated with having a mental illness started to show up. because some aspects of dealing with the financial challenges and planning for the future requires professional advice. And the stigma around mental illness prevented some people from not only from seeking that advice, but in some cases from not fully disclosing, from not really letting it all out there for their advisor so their advisor could help them the most. There were concerns that they didn't really want to explain to the advisor what it really means to have a family member who has a serious mental illness like schizophrenia or a bipolar disorder or serious prolonged depression. And two, they didn't think that the advisor would understand it anyway, not having any personal experience to it. Now think back to before you had any direct experience with mental illness. I'm assuming virtually everybody on this call has a loved one with a serious mental illness. How clueless were you before that happened? I know in my case, we were completely clueless, had no idea what was going on. I found that here, the stigma, when we're talking about stigma, was actually more prevalent with the higher levels of affluence, which I thought was really interesting. When I asked about how an understanding, experienced financial planner could have helped them, the most common answer that I got was that of a guide, someone who could have shown them the right path. Some people eventually found the right path through trial and error, maybe attending support groups and just getting out there and being very, very proactive and talking to others. But it took time, and there was a lot of hit and miss involved. So having somebody who could have pointed them to the right kinds of attorneys to help them with the legal issues, people that really understood, for example, special needs trusts, the right type of investments to be using, having a well-defined process to structure their financial plan would have made all the difference to them. And they wanted somebody who could see the whole picture, but with empathy, and help them make informed decisions. I'll tell you about a client of mine that came in a couple of years ago. Excuse me. I'm going to call them Jim and Amy, obviously not their real names, so we would never use a client's names. But now Jim and Amy had been working with an advisor, a good person, but transactionally based. She made her living selling investment products and insurance products, and that's how she got paid, which is how most advisors get paid. So anyway, Jim and Amy and I, we all sat down and we spent the better part of an afternoon just getting to know each other. I found out what Jim and Amy's values were around money, what it really meant to them at their core. I found out what the most important goals were for them, what kept them awake at night. We talked at great length about who the most important people were in their lives, not just their son with schizophrenia. We talked about not only who those people were, but what the relationship was like with each of them. And we talked about all the resources that they had to work with. And we talked about everybody who works with them and offers them advice and what the relationship was like with each of those people, their attorney, their CPA, their financial advisor. We even talked about what their favorite things to do in life were, what's on their bucket list, what their dreams are. And when we were done, Jim told me something that we actually hear every now and then. Jim told me, "Hey, Alan, you now know us better than any single person out there." And that is what I discovered through these interviews that people were looking for. Someone who could get to know them at that level and guide them through this mess, guide them to the answer for that question for who is going to take care of my kid when I'm gone. So let's talk about some of the specific strategies and tools that really need to be on your radar if you're going to answer that question, if you have any hope of answering that question. So it all starts with the cornerstone. It all starts with the understanding of what government benefits are available to you through Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare. Excuse me. So 10 years ago, If you had told me that my son would be receiving SSI and Medicaid within really just a few short years from then, I could not have imagined it. In my mind, it would have meant that my business had crashed and burned. It meant that I probably had lost my ability to produce income, that financially my family was basically ruined. I just couldn't have conceived how far we would have had to have fallen to be dependent on the government for a handout. I mean, Social Security wasn't for people who make a good income. Well, there are a lot of misconceptions about Social Security out there. For one, so many people think it is a handout, and it's not. The reality is almost all of it is earned benefits. I mean, just look at your paycheck. See that big deduction that comes out? That's your Social Security deduction. A lot of that is. So it's your money that's funding this thing. And the truth is, in our case, it never even occurred to us to even apply for benefits. It wasn't until my wife, she was at a NAMI support group meeting. I think it was a NAMI meeting. We've been to so many meetings where the group leader basically just told her, said, listen, Gail, apply, you'll thank me later. And we did. And the difference it has made in my son's life has been huge, because not only was he able to start bringing in a little Social Security income, but it made him eligible for Medicaid. And the treatment program he's now in is Medicaid funded. So without Medicaid, he wouldn't have been able to even participate in a program which is now making the biggest difference in his life and helping us answer that big question. So generally speaking, I'm going to back up. So if you haven't applied for Social Security, don't be like me. If you're just thinking, I'll do it now, but do your homework first. Before you apply, go online to it's ssa.gov and read the website. It's simple. It's easy to read. Review the application checklist. Read about the items that you're going to need to gather and what the benefits are. Read about the appeals process and what your rights are if you're denied. It's good information on that website, and I could sit here and rehash some of it, I guess, but again, we're trying to stay 30,000 feet up tonight. Otherwise, we'll be here well into the evening. Generally speaking, though, benefits come from two sides. They're either from the SSI side or the SSDI side. Now, SSI is supplemental security income, and SSDI is Social Security disability insurance. So let's talk about the differences. So SSDI is for insured workers, those people that have a work history and have paid into their Social Security account for a certain number of quarters based on their age. So if they're younger, it doesn't take that many quarters. If you're older, it's up to 40 quarters. But if you're young enough, when you were diagnosed, you may be eligible for your parents' SSDI benefits, which is unfortunate if you're young enough, but on the other side, it's probably a larger benefit amount. So that's one thing you want to be aware of, is what age the person was diagnosed at. Because if they're diagnosed prior to 18, or it might be 21, don't quote me on that, I have to look that one up, then they may be eligible for mom or dad's benefits. I think it's 18. Now, SSI is purely needs-based. To qualify, you need basically no assets, at least very little assets, and very little income, and little or no work history, or certainly any contributions into the Social Security system. So typically, SSDI recipients receive a bigger check each month. Oops, there we go. Now, the maximum amount of SSI benefits this year is $771. That caps it out. That there's no more money than that per month available under SSI, where the average SSDI check is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200. But it's not like you have a choice here if you have no work history. If you have no work history, it's SSDI, or it's SSI, my bad. Now, in either case, you're going to be eligible for either Medicaid or Medicare. And as I mentioned earlier, that can make a big difference in itself, giving your son or daughter just access to Medicaid-funded treatment programs. Excuse me. I had a cold last week, so I'm still on the tail end of that. Now, in most states, including Florida, you don't even need to apply for Medicaid if you're on SSI. It's automatic. But for a dozen or so states out there, yeah, you do have to apply separately. It's only about 12 or 13 states. So again, there's a lot of things that we can talk about with Social Security and Medicaid, but today, all I want to do in this overview is just sort of give you an overview. But I will tell you this. I'd urge you to read the section in the in my book, or sit down at the computer, maybe have a good cup of coffee or two, and just research the Social Security website. It's easy to understand, it's easy to navigate, but I do want to emphasize this: just apply, you'll thank me later. Now, having a Social Security cornerstone laid out is, once that's done, I think the next most important tool, or really strategy, you can have is quite simply just a plan. Now realize plans can change. So, if plan A isn't working, you got 25 more letters in the alphabet. But having clearly defined goals and an approach to achieving those goals is obviously better than just, not having any goals at all and just sort of meandering along. So even a basic plan that's written down with some thought is better than no plan, and gives you a much better chance for success. But in reality, what happens more often than not is that we really don't have a plan, but we kind of know what it is that we want, right? So when something comes along that seems like, yeah, you know what, that sounds like a good idea, let's do that, we pick it up. And now it's part of our stuff. And then someone shows us something else. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea, I like that. So let's go ahead and get one of those too. I'll take one of those. And the next thing you know, you end up with this sort of a mishmash of stuff that's like two puzzle pieces that just don't fit together very well. There's a lot of big gaps. They're clearly not from the, they aren't supposed to fit that way. Now that's the plan that we see coming in the front door all the time. And it's usually attached to somebody with this really confused and slightly bewildered look on their face. So how do you come up with a plan? It starts with goals. So remember this story I told you about Jim and Amy a few minutes ago, and how we all took the time to really get to know each other and find out what's most important to them. That's your first step. Figuring out what is it that's the most important and prioritizing that list. Call it goal setting or whatever you want. We call it discovery here at our office because it's really, to us, it's the act of discovering those things that we really need to make sure we accomplish. You need a process to make sure you're covering everything. And I'll quickly share with you how our process works and how we make sure for every family that we work with that we cover every base and we don't leave anything to chance. So we break our planning up into 5 concepts. First, there's investments. Then we focus on wealth enhancement ideas, then wealth transfer ideas. Then we focus on wealth protection ideas. And then last, we look at charitable planning. Now, I'll talk them through just real briefly for you. We know the number one concern that virtually everybody has right off the top is, are they making smart decisions with their money and their investments? And there's just so much more to cover than just investing there. But it's making smart decisions about your money and focusing those on investing. When we talk about wealth enhancement, we're talking about finding ways to increase cash flows and decrease debt costs and taxes, mitigating those taxes. Basically figuring out how to get more money out of what you've already got, how to get your money to go further. Wealth transfers concepts are, of course, extremely critical in this area of special needs planning. And we're seeking the most efficient manner possible to transfer wealth without jeopardizing government benefits. Then we look at wealth protection concepts, where we focus not on not losing assets unnecessarily to potential lawsuits or things beyond our control or things that our son or daughter might do. So we don't want to lose those to unnecessary lawsuits. And finally, where it's not necessarily on everybody's radar, we focus on charitable planning techniques. To some people, this is very important, and we can often use those charitable intents to help in other areas of planning. So those are the categories that we think about when we're working with clients, and you can use those yourself as sort of a way to put things in the right drawers or cabinets. So let's move on, and we've got a lot to cover this evening, but I do want to say that while putting together a systematic plan on your own might feel a little laborious or daunting, I have to tell you that I think it's the most critical thing that you can do. Obviously, I'm a financial planner. It's pretty hard to tell where you're going if you don't have a map to get you there. So investment, let's focus on retirement planning or investing really efficiently. I realized, excuse me one second, years ago that, and it hit me like a ton of bricks this one day, that our retirement plan, my wife and I's retirement plan, wasn't for 2 people. It's for 3 people. And one of them is a whole generation younger. And I really didn't have any room in my investment plan for any waste. I needed an investment plan for myself that maximizes efficiency. And it means I have to have a plan that has the highest probability of reaching my goals. Now, I really have to stretch my return as far as I possibly can and get my money to last as long as I possibly can, because my retirement plan is not for 2 people, it's for 3, and hopefully that 3rd person has a really long lifespan. But I also have to be cognizant that there's a lot of risk out there in the investment community, and I needed an investment plan that, while maximizing those returns over a real long period of time, I just flat out can't afford to lose my money to a risky investment or any promise of a bigger pot at the end of the rainbow that had this huge risk attached to it. So I've been investing my own money and other people's money for 28 years now. Personally, I manage over $150 million in investments, and this is something that I absolutely know to be true. There is a total global capital market rate of return that's out there for the taking, but very few of us really know how to capture it. And while nobody really knows for sure what the future does hold for that return, historically, it's been pretty awesome. Much better, in fact, than the average among us actually getting returns. But here's the thing that you have to learn. You can't beat the market consistently. You cannot beat the global capital rate of return on a regular basis. Now, you might get lucky every now and then by speculating on something, but you can't build a plan around that. You can't expect to do that regularly. So the best you can plan for is the global rate, and you need an investment plan that absolutely is going to assure you that you're going to capture the global capital market rate of return. And that's when you're maximizing your return. There's also this sort of safety valve, automatic safety factor that comes along with a strategy that's designed to deliver the global capital market rate of return. So let me explain it to you this way. If you owned every single publicly traded stock and bond in the US market, what would it take for you to lose your money? Now think in terms of owning all the global stocks and bonds out there too. Seriously, what would it take for you to lose your money? It would take a total economic collapse. And this would be the picture we'd have, right? And that's not going to happen. And if it does, honestly, it doesn't really matter, because cash is worthless and you've got bigger problems in your investment account. So basically, for me to stretch my retirement dollars as far as I possibly can, as well as that of my clients, as far as theoretically possible, I needed a way to assure myself that I'm going to capture the global capital market rate of return. And you're not going to get that strategy from Wall Street. So remember the academic guys I showed you a few minutes ago? One of these guys, the guy on the left, Gene Fowler, actually won a Nobel Prize in 2013 for his contribution to the body of work called modern portfolio theory. This is where you get that strategy. And this is a talk all in itself. So again, I'm going to try to remain at 30,000 feet here. But basically, we're talking about having inside of our portfolios every stock and bond in the market, or as close to every stock and bond in the market as we possibly can. And to put some additional focus or emphasis on large areas within the markets that the academics tell us are worth a little more focus. Take a little more risk here, but historically you would have been well rewarded for doing so on a more consistent basis. In other words, it wasn't a fly. It wasn't a one-time event. So now, with a strategy that you know works and that you know is maximizing your return and therefore your future and that of your son or your daughter, all that leaves you to focus on is costs and getting those costs down as low as you possibly can. It's really so simple. But we get so sidetracked by all of the hawkers from Wall Street and these large investment firms who want to sell us their expensive products. I mean, I was there the first part of my career. I know the games that they play. They're hollow guarantees and nobody understands them anyway. And most of the people end up with these horribly inefficient and expensive investment portfolios that greatly diminish their chance of succeeding goals over long periods of time. And that's probably all I'm going to say about that. So let's move on. I know a lot of people want to talk about able accounts. I think that's great. When I mention able accounts, though, to most people, I get a look back from them like, what's that? Never heard of it. Which isn't all that surprising because able accounts are still, they're pretty new. In 2014, Congress decided that they wanted to help people with disabilities have an ability to supplement their government benefits without jeopardizing those government benefits. So for example, if my son has more than $2,000 in his accounts, he's going to lose his SSI check until that balance falls back down below $2,000. Well, what if, just throw something out there, what if grandma decides that she wants to give him $5,000 just because she's like that? Now, an ABLE account gives her the ability to do that by depositing that $5,000 into his ABLE account, not his checking account. And then he gets to keep his SSI check coming every month, as well as his Medicaid. So Congress passed this in December of 2014, but in 2015, you could not have invested in an ABLE account because basically no states had ratified it yet, and no one had jumped in yet. But by 2016, I know you could, because that's when I really started zeroing in on them. And I remember then there were actually 4 states at the time that were participating, and today we have 40 states that are participating. So almost all the states have jumped in. So the program's growing very, very rapidly. And here's how it works. Now, if you're familiar with or have a 529 plan for your kids, or have had one, they're actually a lot like those. And actually, Congress used the 529 plan sort of as the chassis for ABLE plans. So that's why there's so many similarities. For example, each 529 plan is managed by a state who partners with an investment firm or two to manage the account, or to manage the money. So here in Florida, we have Florida United, or ABLE United, and Florida ABLE has partnered with Vanguard and BlackRock to manage the investment side. So Florida ABLE is where you go to their website, and then they've partnered with Vanguard and BlackRock. Now, each state has a maximum allowable amount that you can have in their 529 plan, which is based on the approximate maximum costs of a college education in that state. So, for example, some states in the 300s, and some states it's even up in the 500s. Imagine that. That's how much it actually costs to get a person educated. Well, able accounts have that same, they follow suit. They have that same limit, but there's a catch. Even if the state says, hey, you can put up to, like in Florida, you can put up to $418,000 into the able account, that maxes it out. But if once you go over $100,000, you will lose your SSI benefits. So for all intents and purposes, all states have the same maximum, and that's $100,000. If you go to $100,001, you lose your SSI benefits until that balance falls back below 100,000. So here's another restriction that comes with 529 plans. And you can only put in $15,000 into a 529 plan in any 1 year. And that's from all sources. So going back to that example where I said my mom, if she gave her, let's say my mom put in $15,000 into my son's able account, and it's now February, right? So she puts in $15,000, she just aced out anybody else from putting any money in his able account for the rest of the year. That's it. I can't put any more money in, he can't put any more money in, and he can't open another account. You can only have one of these accounts. So why they did that, I think just because they were following 529 plans. I mean, it's not like a tax deductible contribution or anything, so the IRS is still getting their money. Makes no sense. Maybe that will change as time progresses. Now, another reason that you might want to put able accounts on your radar is the tax advantage. Now, there's no tax break, as I mentioned, for putting money in, like there is with like an IRA or a traditional IRA. But once the money is in the plan, it will grow without any taxation involved. So you don't get a 1099 for it at the end of the year. You don't have to claim it on your taxes. And then you can take the money out for qualifying expenses, which it's a long, long list. It's basically anything that helps to improve the health, independence, or quality of life of the beneficiary. That money can come out tax-free. So if you've put in, so let's say you've put in an aggregate amount of $25,000, the account's worth $50,000, that extra $25,000 of gain is free from taxes. That's a good deal from that standpoint. But there's an important point you want to, actually there's one other thing I want to mention first. An area where a lot of people get confused, because if you read through the rules quickly, you're going to get messed up on this one. For whatever reason, to be eligible for an ABLE, the beneficiary has to have been diagnosed before the age of 26. Now that doesn't mean that if you're 35 or if the beneficiary is 35, you can't open one. It's just that the diagnosis has to have occurred before the age of 26. If that's the case, they're good to go. Again, don't ask me why. It makes no sense other than, it follows the 529 limits. Hopefully that will change one day, because it really makes no sense. Now, ABLE accounts were designed for the vast cross-section of people in America that have disabilities, not specifically for those with mental illnesses. So one big question I had before I set up an ABLE for my son was, would he be able to access his account on his own and maybe use the money for something that he probably shouldn't? Well, an individual with a disability can set up their own ABLE account for themselves. And I can also set up an ABLE for him as his authorized representative, being his parent. And it doesn't matter how old he is when you set it up, as I mentioned earlier. You can also be an authorized representative if you have a durable power of attorney, or if you're a legally appointed guardian. So anyway, when I set up my son's account, I listed myself as the authorized representative and listed him as the beneficiary. So the question is, I used all my password, my bank account information. It's all my stuff. He doesn't even know, quite honestly, that the account even exists. So the answer is no. He can't get the account without going through me to get it, without me allowing it. But it is his money, and it has to be used for only his benefit. Now, a couple more things about ABLE accounts, and then we'll move on. ABLE accounts have this thing called a Medicaid payback provision. Dun, dun, dun. Not a good thing. You'll also see this in first-party special needs trusts, which we're going to touch on in a minute or two. And this is how it works. Let's say my son dies, and there's a balance in his ABLE account. The state Medicaid office now has the right to claim it, up to the amount that they've spent on him through Medicaid. In other words, they're going to get it. So that's something you really want to weigh and consider before you open up an ABLE account. But really, that's, I think, one of the only drawbacks to these accounts. Now, some of you are familiar with special needs trusts, which we're going to talk about momentarily, but these ABLE accounts sort of sound like, hey, you know, maybe they can accomplish the same things as a special needs trust. You know, does an ABLE account negate the need for a special needs trust? And I'd say probably not, but it might delay the decision a bit to start a special needs trust. It's probably better to think of an ABLE account as a great supplement to a special needs trust rather than a replacement to a special needs trust. To begin with, they're a whole lot less expensive than opening a trust. You don't have to pay an attorney up to thousands of dollars to write the trust. Additionally, if the level of assets that we're talking about to fund the trust is less than $100,000, which, as you know, now is the sort of the true ABLE maximum, then maybe an ABLE might be sufficient for the time being. And there's a number of other things you'd want to consider as well, and everybody's situation is unique, but you might want to consider, like, when and what the money is going to be used for, if there's any restrictions that you need to attach to the money. And of course, if you want to avoid the Medicaid payback requirement, that would certainly be a big point in favor of the trust. All right, so it took a long time to talk about ABLE accounts and whether or not it's right for you, but everyone that has this discussion, probably, everybody's different, and we'll just move on from you. Talk about it with us if you want. If you have any questions about is an ABLE right for you, there's certainly a lot we can talk about there. So special needs trust. So what is a special needs trust, and why might you even need one or want one? Well, a special needs trust it's pretty simple. It's a trust that is set up to put assets into that don't disqualify your special needs son or daughter from receiving their government benefits like Social Security or Medicaid. And it allows you to set up some parameters, like any trust does, on how and when the assets can be used and for what for the assets can be used. Now, there's two kinds of special needs trusts, and this is sometimes where people start getting a little confused. It's not that hard. First, the first thing is there's a first-party special needs trust. Now, a first-party trust is funded with assets that really belong to the beneficiary. Excuse me. Like, say my son or daughter, my son has $200,000, right? And he wants to remain eligible for government benefits. Well, he's blown past the ABLE limit. Can't get $200,000 or $100,000 into an ABLE all at once anyway because of the $15,000 maximum per year. But so he's got $200,000 and he wants to remain eligible. Maybe it was gifted to him, or maybe he won it in a lawsuit or whatever. He could irrevocably put that $200,000 into a first-party special needs trust and therefore remain eligible for Social Security. But the decision, like I said, is irrevocable. He can't get it back. And when he dies, if he hasn't used it up, his first-party trust is going to have a Medicaid payback provision, just like the ABLE account. So it's important to understand that all first-party trusts are irrevocable, and all first-party trusts have a Medicaid payback provision. Now, a third-party trust, on the other hand, is funded with other people's stuff that they put into it, and my son would then be the beneficiary. So let's go back to Grandma. Now, Grandma's escalating the whole thing here. She started with $5,000, then she went to $15,000. Well, now she's got $1 million. Maybe it's a life insurance policy. All right, so she's got $1 million life insurance policy, and she really wants to make sure that her favorite grandson is taken care of for the rest of his life. And so she wants to make sure that he gets that $1 million. Now, this would be a perfect case for a third-party trust, because my mom would need to make the beneficiary of that policy my son's third-party trust. Therefore, when she dies, the money goes to his third-party trust. He's never received the money. He's never touched the money. It's never been his money. It's always been either my mom's or the trust's. Therefore, it can go into a third-party trust and is not subject to a Medicaid payback provision. So that's pretty big. Third-party trusts aren't subject to the Medicaid payback provision, and simply because my son or the beneficiary never really owns the money. These also can be revocable trusts, which is nice, because first-party trusts are revocable. Once you open it and fund it, that's it. You can't pull the money back out unless it's being used for what the trust says it can be used for, but you can't reverse the decision. Where a third-party trust can be reversed. Now, there's also these things called pooled trusts that basically pool the assets of a bunch of people all into a special needs trust. And these can be either first-party trusts or they can be third-party trusts. But the advantage is that they're typically less expensive than creating your own trust. And they also could be more efficient on the financial management side, since you're pooling more dollars, and hopefully there's an economy of scale that's happening. Hopefully, well, not a given. And it gives you the ability to access professional trustees and professional money management at hopefully lower account sizes and have it be more cost effective. So obviously we can spend a lot more time on this subject, but I'm going to keep, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here a little bit, and we need to move on. So I want to get to questions in a few minutes, but there's just one more topic that I wanted to address. And it's about language, actually. And I want to talk to you about people first language. How do you talk about mental illness? So about 4 years ago, I had this idea where I would ride my bicycle across the country to raise awareness and talk about the stigma that surrounds mental illness. Now, it turned into this big deal where by the time we started, we had this 34-foot RV that somebody had donated us and got it all vinyl wrapped with our message on it. We'd been donated these beautiful rider kits, which is the clothing that we wore that had our message emblazoned all over it. And we even had a sponsor donate to us this beautiful high-end bicycle that, these things can run way into the thousands of dollars for me to complete the ride on. So it was pretty cool. It turned into a pretty big event. So after a year of preparations, me and 9 other cyclists left the beach from San Diego, and we rode east, which is probably a good thing, because if we'd rode west, as you can see, we would not have gotten very far. So the grand idea was that we would ride from city to city, starting in San Diego, all the way to St. Augustine, and we'd have press coverage and perhaps an event or two, and help these communities understand how debilitating the stigma was surrounding mental illness. And we try to explain through the press and at these events and on TV how we need to accept mental illness as a disease, just like any other disease that's out there. And that when we stigmatize it, we block treatment for people that so desperately needed it. That, in essence, was our message for that 2 months on that ride. But here's the thing. Here's why I'm telling you all this. Because my understanding of mental illness wasn't mature yet. I didn't really get it, even though at the time I kind of thought I did. But for example, when I talked about my son, and hence our family's experience, I'd say things like he suffers from schizophrenia, or he is a victim of schizophrenia, or he's battling schizophrenia. It simply didn't occur to me that by using these words, I was defining him by his illness. I was saying he was first and foremost a person with schizophrenia. So words, as we all know, truly matter. Come off the screen here. So I find myself being really careful about talking about or not talking about my son's problem. it's the wrong perception of him. Other people that don't have mental illnesses, they're not constantly talking about their problems. You know, I wear glasses, right? I don't go around telling everybody, hey, I have an astigmatism, or hey, I have a problem seeing. I just say, I wear glasses. So imagine the toll that it takes on someone if everybody defined them by that one thing that was wrong with them. What does that do, you know, to a person over years of time, to their self-esteem and their confidence? You know, think how hard it is anyway to get over a mental illness, but when you're always getting beat down, it just makes it that much harder. So what I tell people now is that my son he's 27 years old. I wish I could put a picture of him up here, but obviously I'm not going to do that. But he's extremely good looking. He's a young man with blonde hair and blue eyes, and he enjoys politics. And he's exceptionally good at understanding geography, well beyond just looking at a map. He loves classic rock and many forms of music. And I got to admit, his taste in music and understanding the full breadth of music from classic rock to classical is outstanding. He plays guitar. He paints the most beautiful paintings in a style that is completely unique and truly his own, is beautiful, just like him, and he has schizophrenia. And that's it. Whatever the disease or the disability someone has, it's not what defines them. And consider that when you think about your son or daughter or friend or just somebody that you know that has a disability, whether it's a mental illness or any disability, whether it's physical or anything else. It's just not what defines them. It's not who they are. So I'll take a quick look at the questions. All right. I'm going to answer those two offline. There is one question that we do get a lot of times, especially when I do these talks live. And the question goes typically, do we give second opinions without having to commit to anything, like, for example, hiring us? The answer is absolutely yes, we do. And we typically meet for a discovery meeting, and since we have clients all over the country, actually, I noticed very few people on this call are actually in South Florida tonight. We have people all over the state, it looks like. Most of our meetings are done virtually, online, using like GoToMeeting software. So we do that discovery meeting, and we find out what's most important to the family. We'll figure out where you are now, where you'd like to be, and give you our opinion then on how to best get there. Now, one of two things is going to happen. Either we could see that you're well on track. We've got nothing of value really to add other than the words like of keep doing what you're doing because you're doing great. Maybe there'll be a minor tweak or two for you to take back to one of your advisors, but basically we'll discover that you're on the right track and getting good advice. And we'll tell you that. And you'll feel good because you've gotten validation, and you know, the time will have been worthwhile for you. It works out well for us too, because we are strong believers in karma out there, and you'll take that as a good thing and probably tell somebody else about us out there. The other thing that could happen is that we might find that you could really benefit from some significant changes, whether it's a strategy change or just turning you down a path towards on a path that has a higher probability of helping you reach your goals. We'll show you what we'd recommend, and you're going to feel good again because you know that you'll know something now that you didn't before. And like most people who we found where there's a serious flaw in their plan, they'll probably decide to work with us and take our advice and help them with that. So ever since I was a boy, I'll wrap this up here, I wanted to sail. Now I just wanted to learn how to sail because just the concept of it I thought was just really cool. But the problem was we lived in Madison, Wisconsin. We're basically landlocked, had a couple of lakes. Nobody in our family sailed. I didn't know anybody who sailed. So it remained this huge mystery to me until I was an adult. But not knowing anything about it or really understanding the basic principles of how a sailboat works kept me from going forward with this dream as an adult. And I felt naive. I felt kind of stupid, like, you know, and I was getting to be like sort of afraid, to ask people about it. So then after we got married, Gail and I, we bought this little sailboat. And by little, I mean like little. It was teeny. And this was our first experience sailing. And we took it out into the bay here we lived down in Miami at the time, so we were in Biscayne Bay. And we rigged it the way that the pictures looked like, it was right. We took it out into waist deep water. And again, it was a small boat. And we climbed on and pulled in the main sheet, and off we went. It was such a thrill, but we were probably only going 3 miles an hour. We had no idea what we were doing, and then we eventually hit a sandbar. We kind of toppled out of the boat, and somehow we got home that day. But it gave me this taste. And years later, Gail gave me a present, which probably the best present I ever got in my life, is she gave me lessons to learn how to sail with this wonderful sailing instructor, and his name was Kai. Now, Kai grew up sailing, and he could sail anything, and he was very accomplished at sailing, at concepts and principles, in a way that I could understand, and he could relate it to me in a way that I can understand, and a whole world opened up to me. And today, I think, because of Kai, I'm a pretty good sailor, and I love sailing. So here's what I know is absolutely true. When you're working with somebody who really understands something well, they have the ability to bring you out of a state of confusion and have it all make sense. They've been teaching it for so long, they can relate it in ways, in terms that you can understand. Now, these things that we're talking about tonight, they don't come easy for a lot of people. It's very confusing, it's very overwhelming, and having somebody like Kai who's been through it and knows it better than anybody else out there can make all the difference to you. So that's all I have for this evening. I will get back to you. It looks like another question came in, but we're over time. So I will definitely answer all your questions. Thanks for hanging with me tonight. I hope you got something out of it. And I wish you the best of luck in your unique situation. Let me know if we can help.